November 1974, Wichita, Kansas. The city was gripped by fear as a serial killer was attacking people in their own homes before binding, torturing, and ultimately killing them in pursuit of the thrill.
The police found semen at the scene, so there was clearly a sexual element to this offending. And they also discovered that the faces of some of the victims were quite bloated, which suggests that the killer strangled them and then stopped strangling them and then strangled them again.
The man behind these gruesome killings was living amongst his victims in the very town he was terrorizing.
He is a man who, for all intents and purposes, was upright citizen, and yet, while he was that on the surface, underneath there is no question at all, he was a monster.
His evil is a different evil, mainly because he thinks that he's entitled to it.
His name was Dennis Rader, but he would go on to create a murderous alter ego for himself, a brand of his own.
Rader would stalk his victims. He would attack them in their homes. He would torture them and kill them.
Rader's preferred method of murder, to bind, torture, and then kill, became his name, BTK. It took over 30 years for authorities to bring him to justice.
Wichita didn't have a boogeyman, they had BTK.
His gruesome crimes make Dennis Rader one of the world's most evil killers. January 1974, Wichita, Kansas. One of the world's most notorious serial killers began a reign of terror that would last over 3 decades.
I think the thing that makes Dennis Rader one of the world's most evil killers is the sheer conceit and arrogance that runs through every vein of his body.
The Otero family had just moved into the area where Dennis Rader lived. They became his first victims. He killed 2 children and their parents, leaving their other children to discover his crimes.
Dennis Rader's first murder, he's chosen to kill 4 people. That is quite a significant undertaking. And I think that really is testament to his arrogance and his hubris, that he thought he could do this.
A pillar of the community, involved in the church and a scout leader, Rader would go on to kill another 6 times, with his last murder taking place in 1991 when he attacked Dolores E. Davis in her home.
He's on a Cub Scout camp, which he slips away from, clearly supposed to give him an alibi. Once again, binds her, tortures her, and eventually kills her. This time with her own pantyhose. And he dumps her body a long way away.
But this killer's ego and new technology meant that he was finally in the sights of police and the FBI after he wrote to local newspapers and a TV station to brag about the murders he'd got away with.
If he'd have just sat there and kept his mouth shut, I'm not sure we'd ever caught him. And so, you know, that kind of arrogance and complacency came back to bite him pretty hard.
Rader liked to torture people, and that wasn't just his murder victims, it was the families of his murder victims. So when he has the opportunity to relive and to retell the stories of the horrendous acts that he's perpetrated, he really does seize on that. He enjoys revealing all of the explicit and the gory details.
For the decades he remained uncaught, Wichita, the largest city in the sunflower state of Kansas, lived in terror of the killer who'd named himself BTK, bind, torture, kill.
With killers like Rader, there is always knock-on effects. And someone who is killing in such a way over a period of time is going to damage the community. There is going to be fear. There's going to be looking out of the curtains at the neighbours. It just breeds an appropriate paranoia amongst people. When's it going to happen next? Who's it going to be next?
When he was finally arrested in 2005, his reign of terror came to an end. But even then, he revelled in the attention.
Rader confessed he didn't deny having committed these murders, and actually I think he quite enjoyed having that notoriety. Finally, people knew who BTK was.
This killer's story begins in 1945. He was born in Pittsburgh, Kansas on March the 9th, the eldest of 4 boys born to William and Dorothea Rader.
Rader was born in 1945, and he was one of several children within a very traditional nuclear family. His father was strict, but not particularly abusive, and many children grew up in households like this.
He was upright, he was a scout, he was on all sorts of programs for good children. He had the ability to blend in. He wasn't bullied, for example, as a lot of killers are.
To his friends and family, he was a model child, but in private, Rader began to show his true colours.
Rader claims that when he was a youngster, he abused animals, so he hung a cat and he hung a dog. We do see, in quite a few cases of serial killers, animal harm in the background.
As he went into puberty, he described himself as looking at girly mags, developing a fascination with underwear, and then, significantly, and indeed deeply significant in his later crimes, was a fascination with bondage and sadomasochism.
Having graduated from a local high school in Wichita, in 1965, Rader enrolled in Kansas Wesleyan College in Salina, 90 miles from home. However, he dropped out.
In 1966, when Rader was 21, he joined the United States Air Force and remained in it for 4 years. He worked on systems. He was that kind of man. Systems are very much his kind of thing. He served abroad, sometimes in Europe. As far as we know, not a particularly distinguished career, but not a bad one. He returns to Wichita, Kansas, and marries a girl he was at school with.
Rader marries and has 2 children, and from the outside they do very much look like the respectable cereal box family, just like any other regular American family.
In 1974, Rader suddenly and inexplicably changed from the respected ex-forces gentleman to a brutal evil killer.
There has to be something that set him off, because that first explosion of violence was so shocking, so dramatic, so utterly horrifying that you couldn't possibly have imagined it was like going from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds.
A new family to the neighborhood became his first victims.
The Otero family had recently moved to Wichita because they wanted a new start. This was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. But unfortunately, this was to be very short-lived, because one day the teenage children arrive home to the most horrendous scene.
On January the 15th, 1974, Wichita police were called to the scene. Detective Tim Ralph was one of the task force investigators on the BTK case in later years.
At the Otero house, they were actually called by the children. The 3 older children had come home, and they had found their mother and father. They called, and the first responders, or the first people that arrived at that time, they went to the bedroom, they found the father and the mother.
The scene they discovered was horrendous. Dennis Rader had broken into the family home and murdered everyone in the house in a way that would become his trademark.
He ties up husband and wife with a Venetian blind cord, suffocates them.
The older children didn't want their younger siblings to come home and find this because they thought they were at school. And so the officers went to their elementary schools in the area and found that both of the younger siblings had not made it to school that day.
When officers searched the house, it soon became clear that the parents weren't the only victims. 9-year-old Joseph and his sister Josephine, 11, were both found murdered.
Their 11-year-old daughter is found hanging in the basement, whether he killed her by hanging her or strangled her and then strung up the body. We have a situation where he's created elaborate knotwork and hung the body up. It's almost like some sort of macabre art display.
Rader appeared to have fixated on the younger daughter, Josephine, because he seems to have spent the most time with her body. She was the prize, and the others were just obstacles that he had to get out of the way.
He kills the boy, ties him up, leaves on the floor of his bedroom, again suffocated.
Rader had killed 4 members of the Otero family: 38-year-old Joseph, 33-year-old Julie, 9-year-old Joseph Jr., and 11-year-old Josephine.
The Otero case provided an overall mindset of this person, that he certainly was into some kind of minding fantasy.
The way Rader had killed the family showed the beginnings of what would become his modus operandi.
The police found semen at the scene, so there was clearly a sexual element to this offending. And they also discovered that the faces of some of the victims were quite bloated, which suggests that the killer strangled them and then stopped strangling them and then strangled them again. So literally holding them on the edge of life and death, watching the life drain out of them and then giving it back. So having that power over somebody's survival or somebody's demise is something that this killer very much enjoyed.
This was not, sadly, the act of a madman. It was the first of a series of killings in Wichita that would come to terrify the town.
With few clues as to what had happened or why, the Wichita police were baffled. Just a few months later, in April 1974, Rader struck again.
Rader starts escalating in the classic profile system. Catherine Bright, who's 21 years old, good looking, he forces his way into the house with a gun. Catherine and her brother, Kevin, return at lunchtime to their house.
And he forces Kevin to tie Catherine to a chair and begins to struggle with Kevin. Kevin is fighting back, and Rader really doesn't like this, so he shoots Kevin in the head. Now, miraculously, Kevin survives and he's able to flee and summon help, but unfortunately, it's too late for his sister Catherine.
I think he tried to bind her up, but it just wasn't working, and the whole thing just came unraveled, and he would take out a knife and he would very viciously stab her several times. And then he left thinking that he had killed her, and I don't think he realized that Kevin had run out. And Kevin got a hold of a neighbor who called the police. When the first officers got there, Catherine was still alive, but she was barely breathing, and she couldn't identify her attacker, and she was taken to the hospital, and she died in surgery just a couple hours after that.
She's bound, she's tortured, and she's eventually killed.
Catherine's brother, Kevin, was the first person to give clues as to Rader's identity to police.
He describes a white male, 180 pounds. We were looking for a single person. You were looking for this white male in his late 20s.
Could cover a description of quite a lot of men in Wichita, Kansas. But at least it's something. Rader once again slips behind the mask, returns to being a pillar of the community. The police are left struggling.
With no substantial leads and a brutal killer still at large, it was only a matter of time before Dennis Rader struck again.
In January, they have the Otero killings. In April, they have Catherine's killing and Kevin's attack. They have no idea what they have on their hands. I don't imagine they get an awful lot of these kinds of attacks in Wichita.
By the end of the year, the police thought they'd had a breakthrough in their investigation of the killings.
In October 1974, and the police arrest 3 men on the suspicion of the Otero killings. Rader is furious. This is an outrage. Those were my killings. Nobody else. It's not absolutely not acceptable. You can almost hear him saying it to himself. This is not right.
Incensed that his murders were being attributed to someone else, Rader wrote a letter to the local newspaper, the Wichita Eagle, and hid it inside a textbook at the Wichita Public Library. He then phoned the Otero murder hotline to describe where the letter could be found.
In his letter, claiming credit for the Otero killings, it's not quite well written. It's clumsy, misspelt, bad grammar, but the overall motive is absolutely clear.
Rader attempted to justify the killings with the phrase, "I can't stop it, so the monster goes on and hurt me as well as society. Society can be thankful that there are ways for people like me to relieve myself at time by daydreams of some victims being torture and being mine." Understanding the fear he was causing, Rader went one step further and gave his murderous alter ego a name.
He wanted a brand, he wanted an identity. He didn't just want to be a nameless killer. So he didn't want to get caught, and he also wanted recognition for his crimes. So he had to come up with a moniker: bind, torture, kill.
Dennis Rader was to be known as BTK, and as he communicated with the press, Rader made a chilling threat that he was to strike again.
He'd gone to work for a security company, installing home security kits. Well, you can imagine what the residents of Wichita were doing at this moment. Suddenly, there's a serial killer on the loose. What are they going to be doing?
They bought elaborate security systems and burglar alarms, which actually turned out to be quite ironic because the killer who was targeting the victims had actually worked for a security company. So the very person who should have been invested in keeping people safe was the one who we had to watch out for.
It would, however, be nearly 3 years before Rader killed again.
In 1977, Rader murders Shirley Vayan. Now, she's a 26-year-old mother of 3. Rader follows home Shirley's 5-year-old son.
Once again, he forces his way into her house.
He locks the children in the bathroom and he proceeds to torture and kill Shirley.
The children are screaming in the bathroom. The only thing you must be grateful for in imagining this horrifying scene is they couldn't actually see what was happening to their mother.
Once again, Rader used strangulation to claim his victim. It was becoming increasingly clear that Rader had an obsession with tying ropes as part of his murderous action.
This is so far outside normal experience. The body seems to be almost secondary to displaying his skill at tying knots.
Yet again, Rader disappears the scene as if a ghost. There's no clear forensic evidence. It's a random killing.
Later that year, on December the 8th, 1977, with the police still having no clue about his identity, Rader would strike again.
After the murder of Shirley Vayan, Rader kills Nancy Fox. She's a 25-year-old secretary, and he'd likely stalked her for some time. He's getting better at his offending at this point in time.
He's looking at the house. He cuts the phone lines outside. He waits for her inside the house. He waits until she gets home. She is, if you like, the archetypal BTK victim.
He broke into her house, completely invading her privacy. He tied her up, he strangled her with a belt, he masturbated at the scene. But that wasn't all. He actually called the police. So there is a tape of Dennis Rader's voice. So they have the voice of the offender.
Yes, you will find a homicide South Pershing, Nancy Fox. I'm sorry, sir, I can't understand you. What is the address? South Pershing. That is correct.
This is Rader celebrating once again his own power. Here he is, swaggering. There can be no other word for it. That he knows something that nobody else knows, and he's taken another life.
Within 4 years, Rader had murdered 7 people, and yet the police had nothing to go on bar odd clues and a crackly voice recording. He had continued to evade capture and baffle the police, but he wanted more.
Rader sees all of the attention that serial killers like Ted Bundy are getting, and I think he wants a slice of that action. But he wants to be more than Ted Bundy, more than the other serial killers. And I think that's very much what drives his offending and the form that that takes.
A month after Nancy's death, Rader sends a note to the local television station in which he explains that he can close her eyes so that she can pass away. I mean, it's an act of the most extraordinary vanity. And again refers in the note to the television station to, "I'll be doing it again."
Those 7 murders back in 1978 became directly attributed to BTK, and he had made several communications. He'd sent them through the local paper at the time, so those 7 were always attributed to him.
Local police detective Randy Stone noticed that Rader was enjoying the attention that he was getting.
He liked watching himself on TV. So, communicating with the news media was part of his way of achieving the notoriety and being publicized and everything. And he enjoyed watching himself on TV, and he favored the news media that had the best signal reception on his television.
I think one of the things that sustains Rader's appetite for publicity is that he knows full well that he's not just terrifying individual victims, he's terrifying the whole town. They are in absolute fear. The sales of his security systems are going up rapidly. It's quite clear that there is a serial killer at work. It's quite clear that all the victims are in Wichita, which is not a huge town. And it's quite clear the police have no suspects.
The community were particularly terrified by these murders because the police had to tell the community that there was a serial killer on the loose. They had to do this in order for people to take steps to keep themselves and their loved ones safe. The quiet and the peacefulness of 1970s suburbia really has been completely shaken by these murders.
After scores of officers investigating and thousands of man-hours, the police realized they had nothing to stop this killer. But then BTK seemed to have stopped himself. Years went by without any further sign from him. The case went cold. Could Dennis Rader have got away with it?
He disappears again, and indeed pretty much disappears completely. 2 years pass, 3.
Rader goes dormant for a period of time. Whether there are murders that aren't linked to him or not is a matter of speculation.
As the years went by without another attack from BTK, Wichita police called in the FBI.
The local police form a task force, which ironically they nickname Ghostbusters, to try and find whoever the killer is. They are singularly unsuccessful. They do not get anywhere near Rader.
The Ghostbusters team would keep investigating BTK for the next 3 years.
There was a theory that he was either in jail or dead or had left the area. That theory was the basis for Ghostbusters, was the basis for searching for men that had left the area after 1979.
Over 600 suspects were tracked by the task force, but none of them could be connected with the BTK murders. Questions and rumors began to swirl about BTK's fate, and with no more murders in the Wichita area, some considered the horror over.
So it isn't until 1985 that he kills again. But this time, he moves his victimology. Instead of a young woman, it's an older woman, 53, called Marine. In fact, she lives very close to Rader. Okay, he hasn't actually killed anybody for years. Can you imagine what must be building up inside that tortured mind?
With Marine Hedge, Rader is changing his modus operandi. Not only does he murder her, he then takes the body, of all places, to a church where he poses her in degrading positions and takes photographs and ultimately dumps the body. This is the use of a human being as an object, as a plaything.
BTK was back, still evading capture and growing in brazen confidence.
Rader dumps Nancy's body about 7 miles away in a ditch. Clearly takes some trophies, as is wont, and shows no regard for his victim whatever.
That case was not initially connected to BTK, mainly because it was a completely different part of town. It was a few miles outside of Wichita, and now it's, almost bordering Wichita, but at that time in a little city called Park City.
A year later, on the 16th of September 1986, Rader murdered 28-year-old Vicky Wegerle while she was at home with her 2-year-old son.
Rader spots a attractive 28-year-old mother called Vicky walking towards her house. We're not exactly sure how Rader got access to her, but what we do know is he did exactly what he's done before. Her husband is driving home for lunch. Their 2-year-old son is left in the house with the body of his dead mother. Her husband discovers the 2-year-old sitting on the floor on his own and goes into another room to discover his wife's body.
This time, BTK was not a suspect. Police initially believed this was a domestic homicide, and Vicky's husband was questioned. Judge Kevin O'Connor, who was Deputy District Attorney at the time, recalls the case.
Mr. Wegerle, her husband, was always considered to be a suspect. So at the time I became involved was when the DNA could be replicated, and so they had the ability to replicate the DNA so you would have enough to be able to test it without using up your full sample.
By the late 80s, police were beginning to have new technology to work with, and homicide cases like this were the first places it was being used.
We started to learn about things like DNA, and there was so much more, even video, and the computers came along, and the ability to track people through all those different mediums became something that we had to kind of look back and see if we could use some of that new technology for some of the old evidence.
The DNA from the scene soon proved the husband was innocent, and the Wegerle murder went unsolved. BTK had got away with murder again.
Rader disappears. No contact with the police, no contact with the local television station or the local newspapers. He sinks back into the facade that he's been presenting for so very long of being an upright citizen, married father of 2. Indeed, he doesn't kill again for 5 years.
Rader's final known murder occurred on the 19th of January 1991. The victim, 62-year-old Dolores E. Davis.
Dolores doesn't entirely fit the picture with what he's been doing before.
She's older, quite a lot older. He's on a Cub Scout camp, which he slips away from, clearly supposed to give him an alibi. Once again, binds her, tortures her, and eventually kills her, this time with her own pantyhose. And he dumps her body a long way away. So the police find it difficult to fit a pattern here. This lady, Dolores, is again naked, dumped, but it's not anywhere near the house.
The scenes were different. He removed them from the house. He had to kind of move his victim. His ideal victim had to move to where he could control them more, and that meant a little bit more mature victim.
Police still had nothing that could help them identify the killer.
This time, Rader returns to the body and takes Polaroid pictures of the victim, all the while wearing a feminine mask. Yet again, the police are confused. Rader disappears again off the radar.
BTK had now murdered 10 people. He continued to roam the streets of Wichita, a free man for over a decade. But then in 2004, the 30th anniversary of his first murders, ignites his ego once again.
A local is going to write a book called Nightmare in Wichita. If ever there was anything that was going to provoke Rader's vanity, it was going to be that somebody else was going to tell his story. No, if anyone's going to tell my story, it's going to be me.
Wichita, Kansas, 2004. The residents of this heartland U.S. town knew Dennis Rader as a church-going family man. But for decades, he was getting away with murder, binding, torturing, and killing his victims to build his own sick alter ego, BTK. It had been 30 years since his first murders.
The anniversary of the killing of the Otero family, one of the newspaper reporters did a story to say, here's the anniversary story. It's another year and it hadn't been solved. And evidently, BTK read that story and read in the story that there was a book being written about it. Kind of had the opinion that who's more qualified to write the book than him.
At this point, Rader resumes writing to the media. He wants to be back in the spotlight. He wants to be in control of the story. It's very, very important to him that he has credit for these crimes that he committed. He doesn't want anybody else taking away from that.
Rader wrote to the paper under his usual pseudonym, Bill Thomas Kilman, initials BTK, and included a copy of Vicky Wegerle's driving license and photos from the murder scene. This was the start of a trail of clues connecting Rader to all of his victims.
First of all, he leaves little items that he's taken from the scenes in unlikely places. He starts taunting the police, literally, saying, well, of course, you think you may know, but actually I know, and what's more, I can prove it. Here's some examples.
BTK had returned to tease the police, and they knew that this time they had to catch him. One of his communications allowed investigators to make a breakthrough.
He had left a cereal box at Home Depot here in Wichita.
He thought it was funny that to use cereal boxes because he's a serial killer.
Law enforcement went out to Home Depot and started doing some interviews. And one of the employees there said, yeah, he found something in the bed of his pickup truck, but he threw it out.
He took it home, opened it up. There was a doll. There was some other stuff in there, and he thought it was just some joke or prank, so he threw it away.
He didn't take the garbage down to the end of the driveway, and law enforcement was able to recover that package. And during the course of the investigation, Home Depot was able to provide us with a video of the parking lot. And so we were able to see a vehicle come in, and that vehicle could be identified as a Jeep Cherokee or a similar type vehicle. That was important to us because that was information at that time that law enforcement knew, but he didn't know law enforcement knew.
The police finally had sight of BTK, but with grainy, unclear CCTV footage, it was the smallest of clues. In an effort to keep himself hidden, BTK's communication methods were becoming increasingly complicated.
The police and he start communicating through small ads in the Wichita Eagle. Finally, he asks the police in one of the communications, what if I were to give you a floppy disk with more details of the killings? Could you identify me?
He asked us, be honest, because the police can't lie. Well, we can lie if we're catching a serial killer. And then he was told, you can send us whatever you want. We won't trace it.
BTK sent a disc to the local TV station. The police took a look, and suddenly, with this one mistake, the case was blown wide open.
We were contacted by KSAS Fox TV, and they had received a package. They didn't initially recognize it as being from him, but then when they opened it up and saw the contents, which included the floppy disk, they called the police department. They called me and said, hey, we got a floppy disk.
And I remember, and will never forget, being present when the disk was put into the computer, and Randy Stone, the computer expert, went through the language on the disc, which is beyond me.
You know, at the time, I'm sitting in a little cubicle, facing the laptop, doing thing, and I look behind me and there's like 20 people all crowded around a semicircle around me. So it's one of those no pressure, don't screw this up type of things. So I imaged it, and I opened up the image and started looking through it, and there's the file on there, testa.rtf, which was a Microsoft Office, or it's a Word document file.
And then you see Dennis, and then more gibberish, and you see Christ Lutheran Church. When you saw that, there was another detective sitting next to Randy, who then Googled the Christ Lutheran Church, and there up in the corner of their website was a picture of the president of the church, Dennis. I still get goosebumps remembering that, because you're looking at that and going, that's him.
Finally, the team had a suspect. Now they had to prove Dennis Rader was BTK.
So then we were off and running. We learned that Rader had an address in Park City, and we went down the street that Rader was said to have lived on. You remember that little vehicle that was in the Home Depot parking lot? It was in Rader's driveway. At that point is when you knew, you didn't know how this was going to end, but you knew we'd caught him. And I made a phone call I didn't think I'd ever be able to make, but I called Kenny and I said, we got him.
But police still didn't have enough to make an arrest. They needed hard proof that Dennis Rader was the BTK killer.
They have got no probable cause to demand a DNA sample from Rader, so they take the unlikely step of going to the hospital, asking for a cervical smear that his daughter had given, and comparing the DNA that they got from various crime scenes, the semen they'd found. And they find that it's extremely close. The match is in cream. Must be a family member.
The police could finally move in.
A large contingent of people were sent toward Park City on February the 25th of 2005. And at 12:15, he was taken into custody.
Rader is finally arrested and is eventually charged with 10 murders, including the Oteros.
The police had many crimes they suspected Rader and his alter ego BTK of committing. But at that time, only he knew the full extent of the truth. The interrogation was a delicate affair.
We had broken up the case into several different sections, so we started to rotate in investigators, and he would be more than a year and talked for almost 34 hours. And he almost saw himself as an instructor of, as he called it, the golden age of serial killing.
When they're done with the interviews, I'm back from doing my search warrants. He's in the interview room, and they put the vest on him, and they're hooking him up with the shackles and belly chain and that kind of thing. And I just kind of stuck my head in the door and said, it's nice to be able to put a face go along with the name that I found on the floppy disk. And he looks up, and he's kind of got the shackles like that, and looks up, so you're the one, huh? And I said, yeah, I'm the one. So we kind of joked back and forth. And he was in a good mood. He was joking, and he said, oh, if I ever get out of here, I'm gonna have to find you and stuff your mouth full of a case of floppy disks.
Finally, the infamous BTK was off the streets and in custody.
So we took him over to the jail. Everybody in the holding cells and area in there knew that it happened. The cells in there are all glassed off, and so all the inmates in there, they all come up to the glass, and they're looking at the glass, and then they start pounding on the glass, chanting his name, pounding on the glass, going, BTK, BTK. And then he's got a big old smile, and he's got his hands there, he goes, 2 thumbs up, he's 2 thumbs up to everybody chanting his name. So, he just loved that.
On the 1st of March 2005, Dennis Rader had been charged with the murders of the Otero family, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicky Wegerly, and Dolores E. Davis.
When he first is charged and formally brought before a judge, he refuses to say anything, to plead. So the judge pleads not guilty for him. Rader says nothing. That was in March 2005. In June 2005, he's finally brought to trial. But before the trial properly begins, Rader changes his plea.
So he did not necessarily want to have a hearing. He pled guilty to the murders, and he tried to avoid any type of hearing whatsoever. The district attorney thought that it was very important that the community knows what happened. And the best way to do that is to have a public hearing. Because once it's a public hearing, then it's open.
Now, the monster is really out of the bottle, because Rader is perfectly prepared to accept that he's got away with it for 30 years and that he's going to go down in history as BTK. And what's more, he's going to make sure the world knows just how evil he was.
During the hearing, Rader described the murders, showing little remorse and with no apology, to the horror of viewers.
Most of these sentencing hearings take a couple of hours. This one took 3 days, and they would present evidence from the murders and really just kind of combine, this is what we had at the crime scene, this is what his confession says. And it was just to kind of confirm to the community, this is really him, this is what happened.
And then you had an opportunity for the victims and their families to make a statement, and it was just truly heartbreaking and painful. But hopefully it helped them that finally, after all these years, the person that had murdered their loved one was done, was going to prison.
Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences with a minimum term of 175 years. He remains in solitary confinement, where he will stay for the rest of his life.
One of my favorite shots is him being led into the penitentiary over in El Dorado, Kansas.
There is something about Rader that genuinely chills the soul. And something about that look in his eyes. I can never, ever get it out of my mind. That little smirk, that little glimmer of, I'm better than you. I really am God. I'm not only the devil, I am God as well.
Dennis Rader crafted a depraved alter ego that terrified a whole generation. But it was his own arrogance that would eventually be his undoing. For over 30 years, he was one of the world's most elusive criminals, taunting the police and teasing the press. He brutally murdered 10 people, including 2 children, by binding, torturing, and killing them, all to fit his sick brand, BTK, and make him one of the world's most evil killers. On the 21st of December 1978, police in Chicago were desperately trying to locate a missing teenager and had begun searching the home of a local maintenance contractor.
When they executed that search warrant, they went in the crawl space, and the very first shovel that they dug, they found human remains.
The man they had in custody, 36-year-old John Wayne Gacy, was a popular socialite who spent his weekends dressed as a clown, entertaining children.
At one point, chillingly, he says to the detectives, you know, clowns can get away with murder. Well, never was a truer word said.
In total, Gacy, the killer clown, had tortured and killed 33 young men over a 5-year period. 27 of the bodies were buried right beneath his own home.
Using other human beings, inflicting pain and suffering and torture on another helpless human being, to me is the essence of evil.
The remorseless John Wayne Gacy had proved himself to be one of the world's most evil killers. Over the course of 6 years, John Wayne Gacy kidnapped, tortured, and brutally murdered 33 young men and boys in and around Chicago, Illinois. It was one of the most shocking sets of crimes in American history. The bodies of 27 of Gacy's victims were buried directly below the house he lived in. But this killer's story starts almost 40 years before. John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago, Illinois on the 17th of March 1942. The second of 3 children, Gacy had a difficult upbringing. His father was an alcoholic who was reportedly both mentally and physically abusive to his children and their mother.
His father spent apparently all of Gacy's childhood demeaning him and physically punishing him and telling him how stupid and worthless and effeminate he was.
Gacy's childhood friend Barry Buscelli remembers the physical abuse he suffered at the hands of his father.
If Johnny was 2 minutes late, no food. So a lot of times Johnny ate at our house and stayed at our house overnight. He used to take Johnny when he was sitting at the kitchen table, and he would take his fist and hit Johnny in the face.
The father is a very significant figure in the genesis of Gacy's terrible deeds. For, to my mind, Gacy was always trying to satisfy his father, whom he never could. He was beaten repeatedly by his father, with belts, with brooms. At one stage he was knocked out by him.
These people grow up with such a malignant view of the world and of human relationships, and feeling that human relationships are not based on love and trust and respect, that they're all based on exploitation and cruelty and inflicting pain.
Gacy was a sickly child. He suffered from a heart condition, limiting his involvement in sports activities and consequently alienating him from his peers. Aged 11, an accident in a playground led to his teenage years being blighted by blackouts and hospital visits.
At that time, the swings were wooden base swings with heavy chains coming down. Johnny went to grab it, and the swing clipped him right across the forehead and knocked him to the ground.
By 1966, 24-year-old Gacy was married and had relocated to the city of Waterloo, 300 miles west of Chicago, in the neighboring state of Iowa.
Well, Gacy got married and life from the outside appeared to be relatively normal. He had quite a good job. His wife had 2 children. So they appeared to be the typical cereal box American nuclear family. And Gacy wasn't just a regular family man. He was also quite active in the local Chamber of Commerce, and he played quite an active role. And he was a real figure in the local community.
Gacy had started to build the perfect life for himself, but he was concealing a dark secret. He developed an unhealthy sexual interest in young boys.
There was a son of a fellow JC member who he lured back to his home and he sexually assaulted. So he's abusing power. He's getting into these positions of trust and he's taking advantage, and that's a theme that's going to continue for him.
And then when the kid revealed this to his father and Gacy was arrested for it, Gacy hired another teenager to intimidate this kid, to lure this kid into some remote place and spray mace in his eyes and beat him up and warn him against testifying in Gacy's case.
Despite Gacy's efforts, his victim still testified, but there wasn't conclusive proof of an attack. Therefore, police were only able to charge him with sodomy of the 15-year-old boy.
He pleaded guilty to 1 count of sodomy, thinking he would get a very, very minimal sentence. But the judge threw the book at him, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison.
On the 3rd of December 1968, Gacy was sent to Anamosa State Penitentiary. Whilst in jail, Gacy's wife divorced him. A further blow was dealt when his father died, and he was denied permission to attend the funeral.
Given the perfect nature of Gacy's ability to groom whomever he came into contact with, within a matter of months, Gacy had become head cook at the prison, had convinced the staff that he was an absolutely ideal person. What's more, then convinced the parole board that he was no danger to anybody, and so served barely 18 months of the 10 years of his original sentence.
In June 1970, now aged 28, John Wayne Gacy was released from prison and returned home to Chicago. His friends, family and neighbors were entirely unaware of what had taken place while he'd been living over 300 miles away in Iowa.
His background was not looked into in any way, I think partly because he didn't go into any line of work in which any kind of background check would have been necessary. You know, he began his own business. I mean, none of his acquaintance was even remotely aware of his criminal background.
In June 1972, Gacy got married for a second time, and he and his new bride set up home in the Chicago suburbs at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue, a house that would eventually become one of the most infamous addresses in America. 6 years later, in December 1978, 10 miles from Gacy's house, 15-year-old Des Plaines resident Rob Peast was reported missing by his mother. Detectives Mike Albrecht and Dave Hackmeister began to investigate the teen's disappearance.
Rob Peast was like a stellar kid. I mean, he was the kind of kid that anyone would want as a son. Never been in trouble, never had any inclination to run away, was a good student, very, very much out of character. He would turn up missing. So, that caught our attention, obviously.
And at that time in the late 70s, there was a lot of stuff going on with the hippie movement, all that kind of stuff. But he made a determination very quickly that this was not a normal, quote-unquote, runaway. He didn't have any girlfriend problems, was not involved in drugs or anything like that, just an all-American good kid.
At the time of his disappearance, Peast was working at a pharmacy in Des Plaines.
So he had told an employee and actually his mother that he was going to go talk to a contractor about a job. And he then went out the back door, and he wasn't seen any time thereafter.
Rob Peast seemed to have just vanished off the face of the earth. The two detectives desperately needed to track down the contractor who was probably the last person to see him. Their search would lead them to the door of a 36-year-old man by the name of John Wayne Gacy. He divorced his second wife 2 years previously and was now running a successful business called PDM Contractors. Gacy would often employ young men, one of whom was Tony Antonucci.
At the time when I met him, I was about 16 years old. And of course, like a lot of 16-year-olds, I wanted to get a job so I could afford to have my car. My first impressions were that he was basically a likable guy, kind of jovial, liked to joke around, appeared very normal.
Gacy seemed in many ways like the perfect boss.
Sometimes at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, John would say, "Hey, it's a nice day out, let's knock off early and have some fun or do something," and all normal stuff, just kind of like you didn't expect, your boss to be the one that wanted to knock off early.
Another young man who'd come looking for a job was 15-year-old Rob Peast, but he hadn't been seen since meeting with Gacy at the pharmacy where he worked. Detectives Dave Hackmeister and Mike Albrecht were investigating.
We ran a records check on him, and as it turns out, he had a fairly lengthy background. He had spent some time in Iowa for sodomy, and so it was sexual crimes basically against children.
Concerned by Gacy's criminal record, the police obtained a warrant to search his home.
The warrant consisted of 3 facts. The first fact is that John Wayne Gacy, in fact, was at the pharmacy the night Rob Peast went missing. And fact 2, that Rob Peast had told people that he was going to see a contractor regarding a job. And fact 3, his criminal background. So on those 3 facts, they were able to obtain a search warrant.
On the 13th of December 1978, police conducted their first search of Gacy's home, finding a number of suspicious items.
They recovered various items of pornography. They recovered some books that were titled Pretty Boys Must Die. They also recovered driver's licenses of other young people, and they did a check on those driver's licenses. It was determined that those kids were also reported missing.
Initially, we're hoping to find Rob Peast alive someplace. And it didn't take long to realize that probably was not going to happen.
Another item recovered was a high school ring, which had belonged to missing 19-year-old John Schick, last seen in January 1977. Further investigation discovered that 2 of Gacy's employees had been reported missing. 17-year-old John Butkovich, last seen in July 1975, and Gregory Godzik, also 17 years old, missing since December 1976.
It was an evolution as we went along. I think it was after that search warrant, we're pretty confident there's at least 5 or 6 victims that were associated with Gacy that hadn't been seen.
But with no evidence or bodies, the police could not make an arrest. They decided to begin surveillance on Gacy.
We just said, wherever you go, we're going. If Gacy went into a public place, we were going to follow him in and see what he was up to.
Throughout this overt surveillance, we became fairly friendly with John Wayne Gacy. He knew we were following him. He tried to be cordial with us. In fact, he initiated conversations with us.
He'd play games with the police. He'd go up to their car and say, "Hi, do you guys want some marijuana?" Or just something stupid like that.
He goes into Moose Lodge, and Mike and I, my partner and I, said, we're going to go in right along with Gacy, but we'll sit at a different table. All of a sudden, the waitress comes over with a couple of beers and places of beers in front of us and says, "It's on that gentleman over there." We look over at John, and John gives us the high sign, and we wave back.
Very confident, cocky. Kept on bragging about all property and how much of a businessman he was and how well-connected he was.
John Wayne Gacy had a psychopathic personality, so he really does seek out power and he seeks out control, and he likes playing with people. He's a bit of a puppet master, and I think that was driving his behavior.
Everyone that we talked to just loved John Wayne Gacy. His neighbors, his co-workers, all of his associates, they loved the guy. And we could see that. I mean, the way he was interacting with us was basically the same. And my partner and I would have to, on many occasions, remind one another, hey, listen, this guy is dangerous.
Gacy was considered an upstanding key member of his small community. He was popular and involved in politics. At weekends, he would even dress as a clown and perform for children at parties and at local hospitals.
The fact that Gacy had this other persona as Pogo the Clown, professional clowns usually, will paint their smiles, with sort of gentle, circular things around their lips. Gacy's smile looks like bat wings. There's just something horrifically sinister and monstrous about this figure of Pogo. Just an element that raises Gacy to the level of a kind of mythic American monster.
At one point, chillingly, he says to the detectives, clowns can get away with murder. Well, never was a truer word said. But it took some time for those detectives to fully comprehend that here was a man who was capable of murder, and more than one.
As Mike and Dave continued with their surveillance, detectives back at the station were trying to get another warrant to search Gacy's house. They'd received some disturbing new evidence while questioning his colleagues.
They're young kids, 17, 18, 19 years old. And at times, Gacy had ordered these young kids to go down into his crawl space of his home and dig trenches, and he had told them that there was a sewage issue and that he needed the trenches dug so he could alleviate that situation. But they said that it happened several times and that there was an odor down there that was just unbelievable. So now we're starting to believe, hey, is it possible? And I know it sounds crazy, but is it possible he could have buried someone in a crawl space?
He gets other people unwittingly involved in his offending, and they don't know anything of what's going on. And I think that's what gets him gratification, the fact that he has such power over other people, that they're not joining the dots together, and that he's able to hide in plain sight.
Mike and Dave continued to follow the popular contractor, but they had a plan to force Gacy's hand.
We were on the surveillance for about 7 days. And as the surveillance progressed, what we found out was that he had this huge core support of friends and family and coworkers and the such, and that is really what was the barrier between us and Gacy. So we developed a plan for the investigators to put some pressure on all of these people that were supporting him, and slowly they started peeling back from Gacy, and we were feeding Gacy information that there's possibly looking to execute a second search warrant. He became more and more desperate. And the last day, it was about midnight or 1 in the morning, he contacted his attorneys and met his attorneys in their office in Park Ridge. At that point, Mike and I are outside, and we see the attorneys waving us into the building. It was very uncharacteristic of the attorneys to do this.
The first thing they were telling us, though, is to park your cars in front of Gacy's and don't let him on. If he tries to move, shoot his tires out. You know what's going on here.
It was very obvious to us that the attorneys were absolutely scared to death, petrified. They're pacing up and down. They won't take their eyes off of Gacy. And that pretty much solidified the fact to us that he had confessed to his attorneys about at least a couple, 3 murders.
Dave and Mike knew that Gacy was beginning to buckle. They continued to trail him as he left his attorney's office.
So we follow Gacy, and Gacy is driving like a madman, and he drives to the Shell gas station where he did all of his business. He goes in, and we see a transaction happen in the gas station.
It was very emotional, shaking his hand almost on his side, hugging, that kind of thing, and this is so out of context for Gacy.
So when Gacy comes back out, jumps in his car and takes off, I go back in the gas station, and when I go in there, they throw a couple of bags of marijuana at me, the employees, and they say, hey, listen, we didn't buy this, we didn't ask for it, Gacy just gave it to us.
As Gacy's behavior grew more and more erratic, the 2 detectives at least now had a reason to apprehend him.
We make a decision at that point to arrest him for the drug transaction that happened at the Shell gas station. So we cut off the car, pull Gacy out of the car, and arrest him for the drug transaction.
Devon in Milwaukee.
This was Gacy's final location of freedom.
That's it.
He was never free from this point on.
Grabbed him out of the car. He was all whining to us, why are you doing this to me and all that. And that's where it ended. So technically he was arrested for marijuana possession and delivery. And then we took him to the station.
While in custody, Gacy told detectives he was experiencing chest pains and was taken to a local hospital as a precaution. But he was just trying to buy some more time. The police had obtained the second warrant they'd been so desperate for. On the 21st of December 1978, they searched Gacy's home on West Somerdale Avenue for the second time.
When they executed that search warrant, they went in the crawl space, and the very first shovel that they dug, they found human remains.
Police had finally unearthed the secrets that Gacy had thought would stay buried forever.
So they immediately called me, let me know that there was human remains in a crawl space, and at that time I arrested John Gacy for murder. Gacy says he wants to confess, but really he wants to confess to the surveillance team, both myself and my partner and the other team. And now all of a sudden he's got an audience again, and he's on top of the world. And he knows he can't get out of it at this point, and so he might as well just divulge everything that actually happened.
Gacy told detectives he was willing to draw a map of the burial site beneath his home.
I gave him a pen, and he started right up. He squared it off in the thing, and he started, well, this was a double, and this was a triple, and this was the first guy with put an X on it. Went around the whole crawl space with these places where the body was buried. I mean, they were digging with spoons and everything, but they obviously identified where all the bodies were, and they did an overlay of where the bodies were actually found compared to that diagram that he made, and it was unbelievable. It was right on the money.
In total, 27 bodies were discovered in Gacy's crawl space. It wouldn't take long for news of this horrific discovery to filter out to the wider world.
Then the arrest came down, and that was the headline on the local papers, everything, how many bodies they took out of Gacy's basement.
Well, you know, when Gacy's crimes were uncovered, he entered into the record books, you know, as America's most prolific serial murderer. The notion that this, you know, pudgy, normal-seeming, decent, regular, ordinary guy was living in this horror house, you know, that was just suffused with the stench of death, and that there were the rotting bodies of 27 young men in his crawl space, bringing home and torturing young boys right in the midst, you know, of all his neighbors, and then going off to work the next day.
When we booked him for murder, we asked Gacy where he was born. And Gacy looked at us and said, "I was born in a state of confusion." And he smiled like that, and we captured the photo.
In total, Gacy confessed to the murder of 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978.
Gacy preyed on victims who he knew were not necessarily going to be missed by any family members. Rootless and homeless teenage boys who had no families that were going to miss them or care about their disappearance.
At that time, in the late 70s, kids were running away all the time, and a lot of these kids were reported missing, but there was no follow-up.
As it turns out, he had buried 27 young kids in the crawl space. He buried one of the young kids outside in his backyard, and he didn't have any room left on his property, so he threw 5 remaining victims in the Des Plaines River.
One of the bodies found floating in the Des Plaines River in April 1979 was that of Rob Peast, the 15-year-old boy whose disappearance had ultimately led to Gacy's downfall.
He was very descriptive on what he had done with Rob Peast.
Rob Peast's mom was waiting for him in the front parking lot, and Rob said to his mom, "Hey, I'm going to talk to a contractor about a job. I'll be right back." He goes back in the pharmacy. Gacy is in the back parking lot, the alleyway. And as Gacy's leaving, Rob follows him outside and says, "Excuse me, sir, I understand that you hire young kids, and I'm really interested in having a different job." And Gacy says, "Well, jump in the car, I'll have you fill out an application." So Gacy actually drives Peast willingly to Gacy's house. While there, Gacy starts showing Peast some little tricks of the trade of being a clown. He shows him a couple of card tricks. And the last trick that he shows Peast is the handcuff trick. Gacy actually handcuffs himself and turns around and struggles with the handcuffs, and then turns back and he holds the handcuffs up. And Peast is pretty amazed at that, and he said, "Well, that's neat, how'd you do that?" So Gacy says, "Well, here, you handcuff yourself, and I'll show you how to do that." So Peast handcuffs himself, and he struggles, and he struggles, and he struggles. And he looks at Gacy and he says, "Now, what's the trick to this?" And Gacy reaches in his pocket and pulls out a key to the handcuffs, and he says, "The trick is, you gotta have this key."
This handcuff trick was part of an horrific yet clinical MO.
Gacy, throughout all of the 33 killings, had developed a method of killing these young kids.
He would pick up these victims. Some were kids who worked for him, but most were teenage runaways, you know, and bring them back to his house and giving them drinks. He would sort of trick them into handcuffing themselves or being handcuffed.
Gacy would use chloroform to subdue his victims. Chloroform's an old-fashioned anesthetic, really, so it gets into your lungs and it just renders you unconscious very effectively.
He did what he called the rope trick. And when he had these young kids incapacitated like that, he would slip a rope over their neck, a knotted rope like a loop, and then put the stick in the back like a tourniquet, and he would slowly turn the tourniquet. And he said he had it perfected so well that he knew exactly how the body would react to each half turn.
Putting a ligature around the neck, the first thing it's going to block is the blood vessels, so it prevents blood getting to the brain, prevents it getting back to the body from the brain. It's going to be very uncomfortable, and it can even render you unconscious in a small number of seconds.
And he went into detail on how he would torture these young men. And he, in fact, did double and triple murders. He would incapacitate 2 or 3 people at a time and kill one person in front of the other victims, and then continue to kill the other victims. And he seemed to be pretty proud of that. We used that to our advantage to keep him talking, and he described every killing to a T, exactly how it happened, all 33.
As the news broke across the country, one shocked viewer who'd unknowingly experienced Gacy's MO firsthand was his ex-employee, Tony Antonucci. Whilst working for PDM, Tony had accidentally got a nail stuck in his foot.
John took me and I got a tetanus shot and took me home. And he came over later that evening to check on if I was okay, or that was the theory, but he also had, some wine, and we were drinking, and he was kind of joking around. It was probably 10:30 at night. I was a high school wrestler, and he said, "Oh, you're a big wrestler guy," and he started wrestling around with me. He got my left arm, and he got it behind me, and I felt him put a handcuff on it. I kept flailing my right hand around so that he couldn't get my right arm, but eventually he did get a hold of my right arm, and he knocked me down to the floor with my hands behind me. He left the room for a few minutes, and I realized that if I pulled really hard on my right hand, that I could pull my hand through the handcuff. I could get it out.
By pretending he was still handcuffed, Tony was able to catch Gacy unawares when he returned and turn the situation to his advantage.
I took the handcuff that I had gotten out of, and I handcuffed him on one of his wrists, and I reached into his pocket, got the key, and I handcuffed him behind his back, laying face down. He goes, "You're the only one that not only got out of the handcuffs, you got them on me." And I didn't know what that meant. I thought that this was some type of test that he had performed before. And I let him stay handcuffed for 10 or 15 minutes before I let him out of the handcuffs. And, he had previously agreed that when I let him up, he would leave. And he did.
Tony had no idea just how close he'd come to being another victim of this deadly killer.
I did not fear for my life, and not fearing for my life and not panicking is probably what saved my life. Because I'm sure when I got out of the handcuffs, if I tried to run for the door or do something, he was 33 years old and very strong, and I was 16 or 17. I'm sure he could have overpowered me if he knew he had to.
Tony continued working for PDM for a few months after the attack and only reported the incident after Gacy's arrest. By the time the case went to trial, police had managed to identify the remains of 22 of the victims.
So with Gacy, we have around 30 bodies, different states of decomposition, some of which have been there for many years. Forensically, that sort of scene is a nightmare. You've got so many different things to dig up. It's a very complex procedure. It's very hard work. It will involve a lot of people and a lot of time.
7 of Gacy's victims have never been identified. This close-knit community on the outskirts of Chicago was baffled beyond belief that such a monster had lived amongst them for so long.
One of the effects that learning about these crimes has on the public is that it sort of reduces you to a state of childlike awe and terror and wonder. You can imagine all these middle American suburbanites suddenly hear the authorities bringing out the decomposed remains of young men that had been stored in the crawl space of your neighbor's house.
A horrified public were both shocked and outraged by the crimes Gacy had committed. As the state prepared their case, they were determined to ensure that the man who'd been held in such high esteem by his local community would pay for his crimes in full. The trial of John Wayne Gacy began on February the 6th, 1980 at the Cook County Criminal Courts building in Chicago. At the time, Illinois still had the death penalty. Gacy's defense team were pleading insanity.
It was an interesting trial, and what was so fascinating about it was they had so many different psychiatrists saying so many different things that they all came up with different diagnoses, which really goes towards this picture of this non-intact human being, this bits and pieces of person.
During the 5-week trial, the prosecution were desperate to prove that Gacy was fully responsible for his actions.
There's a difference between psychopathy and mental illness. Psychopaths are rational. They know what they're doing and they know what they do is wrong, but they decide to do it anyway. So he was fully culpable for his crimes.
He was vicious, he was evil, he was not insane in any way. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he killed these people for self-preservation because he was so well-liked politically and business-wise, he couldn't have his public out that he was taking advantage of these kids.
One of the prosecution witnesses was Gacy's former employee, Tony Antonucci, who'd been attacked by the 37-year-old contractor.
I saw him in court, and he was off to my left, sitting at the table where the defense attorneys are, and he just stared straight forward. He was fairly far away. I might have caught his eye on occasion in the courtroom, but I was pretty nervous to be on a witness on a trial of that significance, even at that age, in my early 20s.
On the 13th of March 1980, the jury had made their decision on the fate of John Wayne Gacy.
It didn't take long for them to find him guilty. I think it took maybe less than 3 hours, which was amazing. And then he was found guilty.
It was kind of amazing how fast everything went. When you look at other trials that have gone on, this trial went extremely fast.
In the final moments of the trial, one of the prosecutors, William Kunkel, called him a ruthless, sadistic killing machine. And I think that's a pretty apt description.
Judge Louis B. Garippo sentenced Gacy to death. He was immediately taken to the Menard Correctional Center, Illinois, where he would remain on death row for 14 years. Whilst in jail, he took up painting, selling his artwork for profit.
Even when he was behind bars, he continued to control and manipulate people. He produced several paintings, several works of art, which he sold, and he maintained a legacy even after his death through those paintings. So he was still in control when he was behind bars. He still had power over other people, and he was still able to make choices and decisions.
The profits he gained from these paintings resulted in the government suing him for his earnings. Lawyer Karen Conti took on Gacy's case against the state.
Gacy liked to paint, and he was a terrible, terrible painter. And he painted horrible things like skulls and clowns and creepy things like that. But people bought them, and they paid $200 a shot for him to paint these ugly pictures. So that's the first thing he wanted to talk to us about. But we went down there knowing that what we wanted to do was represent him in the death penalty. What was surprising was he looked and acted just like anybody else, like your favorite uncle, like your next door neighbor. And if you think about it, that's probably why he got away with killing so many boys and men, because he didn't look evil. You could not reconcile what he did with the man you were talking to.
Karen was a firm opponent of the death penalty and represented Gacy during his final appeals against the sentence.
Over the years, Gacy had numerous appeals, and our system allows that. Appeals in the federal court, appeals in the state court. By the time that Gacy had his execution date set, we were out of traditional appeals.
There are certain serial killers, even staunch anti-death penalty advocates, would not protest against the execution of somebody like Gacy. If he felt any twinge of feeling sorry, it was only feeling sorry for himself. You know, these people are possessed of this incredibly malignant narcissism. The only thing that they are capable of feeling anything for is themselves and their own needs.
When you have a client who has committed these horrific acts, 33 murders, no court is going to want to let him out. No court is going to want to change execution to life in prison because it's politically a disaster. Gacy had to be executed, and no matter what we alleged, even if we had really, really good arguments, I don't think anyone would have listened because it was John Gacy.
In a CBS TV interview filmed in Menard Correctional Center in May 1992, Gacy recanted his confession and tried to deny that he was guilty of any of the murders.
He claimed that he was a victim of circumstance and clearly innocent. Now that was balderdash. He was guilty of sin, but nevertheless, it just proved what an extraordinary man he was. And throughout the interview, you can see the interviewer looking more and more astounded by Gacy's relaxation. He didn't look nervous. He looked absolutely composed, relaxed, if anything, a little angry. Why am I being put through this? It's not fair. It was a pure accident. I never did it.
We knew it was his last-ditch effort. You know, everything else failed. He thought he could get away with, insanity plea, and that didn't work. So it was last-ditch effort to say that he wasn't involved or that others participated. But it was very clear during his initial confession that he was the one who completed these crimes and completed them by himself.
Gacy never took responsibility for his actions, and he would always blame others. He would blame his victims, and in some cases he blamed his victims' parents. He would turn around and say, well, it's not my fault. I'm completely not responsible for any of this. And that's a key psychopathic trait, the failure to take responsibility for their own actions.
Despite numerous attempts to appeal his death sentence, on the 10th of May 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois.
It was a circus. We were in a room at some point and we saw a television screen and we saw thousands of people lined up at least a mile down the street at the prison with signs, "Kill the clown, kill Gacy," with our names on it, "Kill Karen Conti." People beating drums, people dancing, people with clown makeup on. It was a celebration.
Gacy's last words were, "Kiss my ass." Those are the words of a man who absolutely didn't mind what he'd done, who was proud of himself and proud of that killing spree, which makes him particularly chilling.
Gacy was unrepentant right up until his last moments. He clearly felt no remorse for any of his 33 victims.
Using other human beings, inflicting pain and suffering and torture on another helpless human being, to me is the essence of evil.
After the execution, you'd think there'd be closure. But there really isn't closure for something like that. I mean, you always think back to the victim's family and the poor young boy who was 15 years old and just a good kid. So as much as you'd like to believe there was closure, there really wasn't closure.
40 years after being attacked, Tony Antonucci feels relieved he didn't become one of Gacy's many victims.
I do feel very lucky to be alive. I don't know what to attribute that to. Maybe luck definitely. The biggest component, a little bit of help from above, and basically my own ignorance of the fact that I was truly in danger and the fact that I didn't panic and just wanted to win the game, if it was a game, is probably what helped. I also would have been one of the earlier victims, so I'm sure his techniques became more honed after he was divorced and lived alone and had more freedom to act differently.
John Wayne Gacy remains one of the most infamous killers in American history. His horrific murders continue to haunt the nation to this day.
I still get weird emails. I still get weird things where people lash out and say terrible things to me about representing Gacy. So as Gacy said to me, your obituary will read, Karen Conti represented serial killer John Gacy. And although I won't be around to verify that, I have no doubt that's what it will read.
For kids, monsters are real. As you become an adult, you realize, well, there are no real werewolves, there are no real vampires. But then something like this happens, and It's like, whoa, this monster is real. There is this ogre. It's transfixing, it's riveting. It's fascinating in the most horrifying way.
Gacy was the epitome of evil. And he was the epitome of being a great guy, which gave him the ability to be the most evil guy in the world.
Gacy's outward persona of a charming socialite helped to keep his crimes hidden for over 5 years. But behind the mask of this friendly clown was a sadistic killer who cruelly and savagely ended the lives of 33 young men by torturing them in the most hideous of manners, all for his own selfish sexual gratification. His lack of remorse for any of his victims or their loved ones, right up until the day he was executed, proved that he is, without doubt, one of the world's most evil killers. In November 1957, police in the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, were searching for a missing woman named Bernice Worden. They were about to make one of the most gruesome discoveries in U.S. criminal history.
One of them turned on his flashlight and beamed it around and saw this object that was hanging from the rafters, which at first they thought was some kind of gutted deer. They realized, to their incredible horror, that it was a woman's corpse that was hanging by its heels.
The twisted killer was a quiet loner named Ed Gein. Hidden inside the 51-year-old's rural farmhouse was a ghoulish treasure trove of human remains.
There was a lampshade made of human skin. They found the remains of 12 human heads, gloves made out of the skin from a corpse's fingers.
You think of this happening, now, it'd still be shocking. But back then, in a small, tiny rural community, it was breathtaking.
America had woken up inside the nightmare of Ed Gein, one of the world's most evil killers. The gruesome crimes of Ed Gein horrified 50s America. When his rural home was searched on the 16th of November 1957, the police uncovered a Gothic house of horrors. As well as the remains of 2 missing local women, they found an array of human bones, skulls, and skin that had been fashioned into furniture and clothing. The town of Plainfield was in complete shock. One of the residents who remembers the effect Gein had on Plainfield is Max Harrington.
I think shock would be the biggest thing that we could use to describe the atmosphere in the community. We were still pretty much a clannish community at that time, and a lot of the families that were here had always been here. It took your breath away, it was shocking. It still is. People don't do things like that in a small town on a normal day. That's just not part of what we grew up with.
The story of this twisted killer begins over a century ago. Ed Gein was born in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, on the 27th of August, 1906. By the time he was 8 years old, his parents moved Ed and his older brother Henry to Plainfield.
Well, the Gein family moved to Plainfield from La Crosse, Wisconsin, partly because the mother of the family, the matriarch, Augusta, had decided that La Crosse was a kind of Sodom and Gomorrah-like hellhole, and she didn't want her children to be corrupted by all the immoral influences of the big city. Needless to say, La Crosse was not a particularly big city, but they moved to a remote farmhouse about 6 miles west of, you wouldn't necessarily say downtown Plainfield because there was no uptown Plainfield.
It's not the largest city in the state of Wisconsin, but it's plenty big enough for those of us that live here.
Plainfield was a very remote, isolated, featureless little village. A state guidebook at the time described it as totally nondescript. The population was very small, never more in its history, I think, than 700 or 800 people. You know, probably the entire population of the village could have fit into a New York City apartment building.
The Gein's 150-acre farm was located on the corner of Archer and 2nd Avenue. Ed rarely got to leave the property and socialize with other children.
His mother, Augusta, is a very domineering character indeed. She is a devout Christian and she has some very extreme ideas about sin and about morality. And she drums into her sons that they're not to socialise with anybody outside of the family because all of the people around them in the local town are sinners, they're evil, all the women are whores. And so she creates this very insular family environment where they're quite isolated from the rest of the community, and that has a really significant impact on them.
Gein seemed to have been very friendless. Whenever he would make some kind of friend, on those rare occasions when he would try to make a school friend and bring home a school friend, the mother would immediately find some reason to disapprove of the other child and forbid Ed from ever bringing him home. So he grew up again in a state of complete social isolation.
And Gein's relationship with his father was also far from perfect.
Well, the father, George, was an alcoholic. He appeared to have been somewhat free in his use of physical punishment, but mostly the picture that emerges of George is of, kind of a hapless individual who was, as all three male members of the family were, under the thumb of his wife, and again, who was regarded as much as anything else as a sort of obstacle or impediment to the household.
As Ed entered adolescence, his life became even more insular.
He dropped out of school when he was around about 12 or 13 to work on the family's farm, and he was considered to be a bit of an oddball. He was quite a loner, and he enjoyed quite solitary pursuits, so he really quite liked reading and was quite a prolific reader. So he was somebody who didn't really fit in, but worked incredibly hard to keep the family farm going.
On April 1st, 1940, Ed's father, George, died of heart failure, leaving 33-year-old Ed, his brother Henry, and Augusta alone on the family farm.
Ed's older brother, Henry, seemed to have freed himself a little more emotionally and psychologically from Augusta's dominance, and even apparently on a couple of occasions expressed some criticism of their mother and the hold she was exerting over both of them. So Ed, who at least on a conscious level worshipped his mother and saw her as a kind of goddess who could do no wrong, appears to have been both a little shocked, that Henry would find any cause to criticize Augusta, and possibly built up some kind of animosity toward Henry for that attitude.
Ed became a handyman doing odd jobs around Plainfield to help with living expenses on the farm.
We used to see Ed occasionally. I'd see him around town, and then he was always a friendly person, quiet, friendly, usually had a joke to tell. He always had time to say hello and ask after how you were. A person who you would never suspect of anything other than being a decent sort of person.
In May 1944, death would hit the Gein family once again, but this time in more suspicious circumstances after a brush fire on their farmland got out of control.
Ed and Henry were out there trying to put out the fire, and they got separated, and Ed could not locate Henry, and he went and got help. But then after getting this help, he led the other people directly to where Henry's body lay, and there were some mysterious bruises on Henry's head. Anyway, the official verdict of the medical examiner was that Henry had died of a heart attack while fighting this fire, and had injured his head when he fell and hit a rock. But afterwards, when Gein's crimes were uncovered, there was a lot of talk that perhaps Henry had been a victim of Ed's, that Ed, in fact, had killed Henry partly because of Henry's criticism of Augusta.
The impact upon their mother, Augusta, was phenomenal. She really broke down about Henry's death, and she had a stroke.
But of course, by then, the psychic bond between Augusta and Ed was so incredibly intense already. Evidence seems to suggest that with the other two men out of the way, Ed reveled in having his mommy alone to himself.
But Gein's mother never really recovered from her stroke, and their time alone only lasted for 19 months.
Ed nursed her very, very diligently, even apparently would get into bed with her on occasion and stroke her and comfort her. And then she seemed to recover, but then she suffered another, this time fatal stroke.
Augusta Gein died on December the 29th, 1945. 39-year-old Ed was completely devastated.
Because his mother was so domineering, I think she really did stunt his development, and he almost got stuck at a kind of teenage adolescent phase in his life. So looking at how he behaved at the funeral, he was in his 30s at this time, and he was reported to be wailing like a small child. So he hasn't got that kind of emotional control that's associated with 30-something men.
The death of his mother left him completely isolated. Living in this increasingly ramshackle, dilapidated farmhouse that he ceased to take care of whatsoever. Augusta was his only real human contact. So it was at that point, that Gein embarked on these various outrages that would ultimately make him this notorious figure in American crime.
Alone and isolated from the rest of society, Gein spiraled out of control. Over the next 12 years, he became obsessed with recreating the world he'd shared with his mother. It would lead him to a series of dark and disturbing crimes that would eventually culminate in murder.
One of my summer jobs when I was a student in high school was mowing the cemetery. And two of my buddies and I, that was about a 4-day job for us to mow that. And we would see Ed out there on occasion. He'd come out, and if he saw us working, he'd always come over and say hello. And again, sometimes have this little story to tell. And he was very good about stopping to see his mother's grave.
I think neighbors saw him as an odd, very meek, somewhat simple-minded person, but one who was always willing to pitch in when some farm work needed to be done or some chore needed to be run for them. But they, of course, had no sense of the life that he was pursuing inside that incredibly creepy, dismal world of his own farm.
It was a world that 51-year-old Gein had managed to keep hidden away until the winter of 1957.
November 16th, 1957 was the first day of deer hunting season that year. And it was a day when basically the entire male population of the town would have been out in the woods hunting deer, as Ed knew. Ed drove into town to the Warden hardware store. The Warden hardware store was owned by a woman named Bernice Warden.
I knew Mrs. Warden quite well. She and her family ran the hardware store here for many years. Almost everybody in the community knew Mrs. Warden.
Ed had kind of been hanging around the store for a couple of weeks previously. He had developed something of an obsession with Bernice Warden.
He would talk to her, he would ask her out, and it was quite clear that she really wasn't that interested in him.
Ed came in, asked to buy half a gallon of antifreeze, which Bernice Warden poured out for him and wrote out a receipt. He went back out to his truck, then came back inside and asked her to see a rifle that was in the window. When Bernice Warden turned her back to him, he shot her in the back of the head and then loaded her corpse in his truck and drove back to his farm.
Gein had murdered the 58-year-old woman in broad daylight.
It was deer season, so deer season is like a ghost town around here. Everybody, in those days especially, everybody was out hunting. And she wasn't even missed for some hours. And when someone reported that she wasn't at the store, well, that was her son, of course.
Later that day, Frank Worden returned from the woods and found the store empty. His mother wasn't there. He was very perplexed by that. And then he saw a trail of blood across the floor of the hardware store, and not only realized, that some foul play had occurred, but immediately suspected Ed Gein, because Gein had been kind of bothering his mother for the past few weeks.
And there was one piece of evidence that confirmed Frank Worden's suspicions to the police.
When they went to search the place, they found the receipt for the antifreeze that was in Ed's name. And they just worked backwards, saying that he was probably the last person to see her alive, but they didn't suspect that he was as deranged as he was.
One set of lawmen went out in search of Gein. They found him having dinner at a neighbor's house, and they arrested him. And then another set of lawmen went out to Gein's farmhouse, and that's where they made these discoveries that really sent shockwaves around the world.
On a dark winter's night, officers from the Plainfield Police Department began to search the Gein farm for Bernice Worden.
They couldn't get into the house, so they went around back and entered into what was called the summer kitchen, which was a little shed outside.
This property didn't have any electricity, so they were pretty much fumbling around in the dark with flashlights, but I don't think they expected to find what they did find there.
One of them turned on his flashlight and beamed it around and saw this object that was hanging from the rafters, which at first they thought was some kind of gutted deer. Although it didn't look like a deer, they realized to their incredible horror that it was a woman's corpse that was hanging by its heels and been completely gutted.
She'd been strung up, essentially, and she was slit from her sternum to her pelvis. So she'd essentially been butchered by Ed. It really was the most grotesque thing that these officers had ever come across.
And they realized they had found the body of Bernice Worden. And of course, both of them just stumbled out in horror and vomited, at the sight of this thing.
When the news spread across the town, the residents of Plainfield were in complete shock.
When I heard of his arrest, I couldn't believe it. I was sure they had the wrong person, because it just didn't seem like anything that they were telling us was the Ed that we all knew. Yeah, it was a Saturday night. We were at a dance, and the story went through there, and everybody said, "I don't believe it," but it was true.
After finding the butchered body of Bernice Worden in a shed at Ed Gein's farm, the police officers moved their search into the main house.
He boarded up some areas of the family's home to maintain the rooms as his mother had left them. And in other parts of the property, he just started hoarding things. You would have trash and rubbish build up, and it really became a complete hovel.
He'd reverse the normal process of trash disposal, and instead of taking all his garbage to the dump, would go to the dump and bring it into his house. It was just this incredible chaos of trash and garbage.
But there was more than just household waste.
Amid all that wreckage, they discovered these incomprehensible, unspeakably awful objects that had been fashioned out of human body parts. There were chairs that were upholstered in human flesh.
There was a lampshade made of human skin. They found the remains of 12 human heads, gloves made out of the skin from a corpse's fingers.
There was a jar containing human noses. There was a box full of female genitalia, some of which had been painted and tied with ribbons. There was a belt fashioned out of female nipples. There was a shade pull made of human lips.
They found all types of things that belonged to people that were no longer people. And it was shocking. I mean, you think of this happening, now, it'd still be shocking. But back then, in a small, tiny rural community, it was absolutely, it was breathtaking.
Ed Gein's farmhouse was the habitation of a literal ghoul. Somebody who had been living amidst these horrific relics of human dismemberment. It was a madhouse.
Gein's fascination with death and corpses had been growing ever since his mother had died 12 years previously.
Ed had always enjoyed reading. It was quite a solitary pursuit, so that's not particularly surprising. But after the death of his mother and his brother, he started to read an awful lot more, and his tastes in literature really did span quite a wide spectrum. He read pornographic magazines, he read medical textbooks, and he developed a particular interest in Ilse Koch, who worked at one of the Nazi concentration camps and collected patches of skin of the prisoners who were detained there. And I think all of this was fueling a very active imagination. So he's developing these obsessions and these interests, and he's quite skilled as a farmhand at this point in time. He knows how to slaughter animals, he knows how to prepare carcasses. He's from a community that's very much into its hunting and its fishing. So at some point, reality and fantasy are going to collide.
As the search of the farmhouse progressed, officers found that the grotesque collection of body parts became even more disturbing.
Among the most hideous of all the items were human skin masks that were hanging from the wall of his bedroom, the faces of women that had been flayed from the skulls and that had been preserved. Some of them had lipstick applied to them and that had been hung on the walls as decorations. And then, most notoriously, there was a skin suit that Ed had crafted out of the upper torso of a woman and the leggings of a woman. And apparently, as he later confessed, he would put on this skin suit and put on one of the female skin masks and caper around in his yard, pretending to be his mother.
Gein's macabre collection had been acquired from the very same cemetery where his mother's body lay.
2 years after the death of his mother in 1947, he starts grave robbing. So he's going into a local burial ground, he's digging up bodies, and he's taking things from the bodies. Now, he's not taking jewelry or items of any value, he's actually taking body parts. It really is an absolute house of horrors. So what started off as an interest, which was confined to the pages of a book, has now become a reality behind the doors of this rather bizarre house. So what he's doing in a really grotesque way is trying to bring his mother back to life in some way, shape or form, because he was just so dependent upon her for a sense of his own identity.
And the search wasn't over yet. Officers would soon discover, inside a paper bag in Gein's home, the severed head of a woman who'd been missing from Plainfield for over 2 years.
I think that the real tipping point for Ed Gein was when his mother and his brother died, because even though this family was very intense and rather extreme in its beliefs, it was still a check on his behaviour. There was still that informal surveillance over him, and I think that kept him contained. But once he was on his own, he was free to ruminate and fantasise, and his behaviour was only going to escalate.
You know, it's like some crack opened up, you know, in the civilized part of his head, and all this weird, archaic stuff going back to the days, you know, when our species did engage in these bizarre, unspeakable rituals, you know, flooded out and took possession of him.
With Gein in custody, officers continued to scour his home, and they were about to make another startling discovery. A local woman who'd been missing for almost 3 years.
There had been a female tavern keeper named Mary Hogan, who ran this roadside tavern outside of Plainfield, who had disappeared very, very mysteriously.
In those days, we had 18-year-old bars where teenagers could go in and have beer. And she ran one of those. It was a kind of a modest place, to be very kind. But she disappeared before I was old enough to frequent those establishments.
When she went missing, he'd said some rather bizarre things. He said to one of the townspeople, "Oh, she's not missing, she's up at the house." But because he was a bit of a misfit and because he was a bit weird, people didn't really take what he said very seriously at all. So that one was allowed to slip under the radar until this grisly discovery a few years later.
In searching through Gein's House of Horrors, the investigators opened up some receptacle and saw this face and pulled it out and realized it was Mary Hogan's, that she had been another one of these victims.
Gein had murdered Mary Hogan on December the 8th, 1954, 3 years previous to killing Bernice Worden.
I think there was some sense in which he associated her with his mother. You know, she almost seemed to be like the shadow side of his mother. And I think in killing her, again, he was both enacting some kind of homicidal rage toward his mother, but I think also there were times when he just ran out of suitable female corpses and had to make his own.
Back at the local police station, it was time for Ed Gein to start talking.
Well, for the first day after his arrest, I think Ed felt like a bit of a fish out of water. He didn't quite know how to react. But he did start talking after about 24 hours. And the first thing he said was that he wanted an apple pie with a slice of cheese on it. And that really does show the emotional immaturity of this guy. And when you've got somebody whose development stops at a particular point, they don't develop those complex emotions that enable them to empathise with other people or to think through the consequences of their actions. So what you've got here is a teenage boy in a man's body, and he was capable of some really terrible things.
He was subjected to a very lengthy interrogation. He freely confessed to the murders of Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. When the police first broke into Gein's house and discovered this crazy mass of body parts, their first assumption was Gein was a serial killer. It was only during his interrogation that he revealed that they were taken from the corpses he had dug up from the local cemetery. And people, in a way, had a harder time believing that than that he was a serial killer. That seemed like totally beyond the bounds of belief for a whole variety of reasons.
Human bodies are traditionally buried 6 feet underground. That's a lot of digging, that's a lot of work to get to them through packed earth. He'd need spades, picks, he'd need to be strong, and he'd need, one assumes, to do it at night because he'd need to be undisturbed.
I'm not sure he did recognize that what he was doing was wrong. You know, there are some necrophiles who think, well, I wasn't really hurting anybody. You know, they were dead anyway.
Gein confessed to investigators that between 1947 and 1952, he'd regularly visited the local cemetery after dark.
He would often follow the local newspapers and read the obituaries, and when some middle-aged or elderly woman who bore some vague resemblance to his departed mother died and was buried, he would apparently go out to the cemetery at night while the soil was still fresh and easily dug up, and exhume these coffins and remove the bodies, and sometimes take the entire corpse back to his farmhouse, sometimes just take parts of the corpse back to the farmhouse and leave the rest there.
Investigators decided to dig up some of the graves to see if Gein was telling the truth.
When they uncovered them, they discovered that the coffins had been broken into, and the bodies were missing, or, you know, there were just parts of the skeleton remaining there.
He admitted to grave robbing 9 corpses, but the maths didn't quite add up because the police had found 12 human heads in Gein's property, and he'd only admitted to 11 offences against separate people. So the numbers never really added up properly. So there's always been questions over that.
Ed Gein's crimes were in the late 50s, 1957. The state of forensic science in those days was far less than we have now. Things like DNA simply didn't exist as a tool, so identification could potentially be very difficult, and I would suspect in certainly some of the body parts simply impossible.
There was no doubt that Gein specifically targeted females. All the graves he desecrated belonged to women.
I think he was both trying to rebuild his mother, but I also think that he was taking revenge on his mother. That kind of love and hate of Mommy were manifested both by his attempting to bring her back from the dead, but also perpetrating, you know, these atrocities on the corpses of female bodies.
It's been reported that Gein did in fact try to return Augusta to the family home after her funeral.
There's some indication that he initially tried to exhume his mother's corpse. You know, apparently Ed missed the presence of his mother so much. You know, he wanted to bring her back and somehow, in his madness, you know, reconstitute her in his household. He couldn't get to his mother's grave because the soil in that part of Wisconsin is very sandy, and many coffins are buried within concrete vaults to prevent the sand from collapsing on them. And that was apparently true of Augusta Gein.
In November 1957, Ed Gein was charged with the murder of Bernice Warden. The media descended on the tiny town of Plainfield, Wisconsin.
What kind of a man did you know him as? Well, a man is a nice man, just like anybody else. The only difference I'd say in the man, he seems to be a little hot.
Well, the cultural context of the Gein case is quite an interesting one, because I think this was one of the first cases that gathered an awful lot of attention. There was a media circus that developed around this because nothing like this had ever really happened before. It was something completely new.
It spread very quickly through the local newspapers and, you know, and then through the Associated Press and so on to the national media. You know, Plainfield, which, you know, had always existed from the time of its founding in happy obscurity, you know, suddenly found itself to be the center of national and even international attention.
It was just an exasperating time, and then we were inundated by nosy Nellies that all thought that, boy, I got to go drive by that old farmhouse. And then we became I don't like to use the word chaotic, but a very unsettled community for a while.
Plainfield was suddenly famous, and famous for the most horrifying of reasons, you know, that it was the home of America's most notorious psychopath.
The entire community was stunned. For the previous decade, they'd been living in the same town as a real-life bogeyman. It would now be down to the courts to decide whether or not Ed Gein was insane. On November the 21st, 1957, the 51-year-old pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity at his arraignment at Wichita County Court, and it was declared that he was unfit to stand trial.
There were indications that Ed was clinically psychotic, that he had hallucinations, that he heard voices, or the trees would start talking to him. Most serial murderers are not psychotic, but Ed seemed to have the symptoms of some form of psychosis.
Gein was sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Warpen, Wisconsin, which is now a maximum security prison. 70 miles away in Plainfield, the community was trying to get back on its feet, but the shadow of Ed Gein lingered over the town.
In 1958, the property that Gein had lived in was due to be auctioned off. And I think the last thing that local people wanted was for this to become some kind of shrine, some kind of attraction for people who were morbidly fascinated. So a few days before the auction, the property was burned to the ground, essentially.
A lot of talk of arson. They had been cleaning up around there and had been burning trash up around the that particular day too. So then that was, or anyway, that was an excuse of a possible cause that maybe the wind got something in the evening and got some live embers in there. A lot of the neighbors weren't too happy with having talk of it being turned into a museum of sorts, but there were a lot of stories. Anyway, it's gone. People still kept coming though, even after the house was gone. For a year, still had people coming to drive by the empty lot where the house used to stand.
In March 1958, the car which Gein used to transport the bodies of his victims was bought at an auction for over $700 by a carnival operator who charged fascinated Americans 25 cents for a photograph at a macabre sideshow.
I think what we're seeing here is the rise of the serial killer consumer culture. People are fascinated in these kind of cases, and some criminologists refer to this as wound culture, that we're essentially drawn to the trauma and the suffering of other people, and we're drawn to the artifacts that exist around these cases.
Gein remained in the Central State Hospital for 11 years until doctors determined that he was finally fit to stand trial for the first-degree murder of Bernice Worden. The hearing lasted for a week, and on November the 14th, 1968, Judge Robert Gulmar had reached a verdict.
He was tried and found guilty of the murder of Bernice Worden, but then he was judged insane and stuck back in the mental institution.
I think that was possibly somewhere where he may have thrived, because he had structure, he had a routine, he had people watching over him and looking after his needs.
Forensic psychologist Dr. Helen Morrison interviewed Gein during his time in hospital.
I was working at that time as a staff psychiatrist, and I was covering all the units. And when I was asked to go over to see this person, I went over to see it, and I saw Ed Gein. He was not at all coherent. He was such a little person that I found it hard to picture him as the person who'd committed all these homicides. He lived there very peacefully. He never caused any problems, never had any type of behavioral thing, no type of I guess you could say, consequence for bad behavior.
Gein's quiet nature in hospital was in stark contrast to the monster Helen had heard so much about.
I received a letter from one of his neighbors who used to be a friend of his. She was a little girl, and she remembers going over to his house, and he would serve soup and everything. Well, it turned out the soup bowls were the skulls of many of his victims, and people never knew it.
On July the 26th, 1984, Ed Gein died of lung cancer, aged 77. He was buried next to his mother on the Gein family plot at the same cemetery which he so often desecrated during his career of horror. Gein has left a lasting impact on the small community where he committed his ghoulish crimes.
We really wouldn't care to have that be our claim to fame. You know, we've turned out lots of doctors and architects and some really good people out of our schools here. We're very proud of them. We'd rather be known for a tremendously good population than to be credited for only one issue.
But just like the carnival operators of the 1950s, people continue to try and get their hands on grisly souvenirs related to Gein.
In the year 2000, somebody was found to be selling parts of the gravestone that had been erected at Ed Gein's grave. For people who are fans of the serial killer cult, this was just the gift that kept on giving.
They keep putting up headstones, and the headstones keep disappearing. There's a whole category of collectible that has come to be known as murderabilia, and Gein relics are particularly prized among people who collect that kind of morbid relic.
Over 60 years since the horrific crimes, Gein has grown into a notorious figure in American folklore, a killer of almost mythic proportions.
The two things that are fascinating about Ed Gein is the fact that he only, as far as we know, murdered 2 people, which is a lot less than many infamous killers, but he's had such a huge legacy in films, books, music. He seems to have become a sort of pop culture murderer.
At the time the Gein crimes were being revealed in the press, there was a writer of pulp horror named Robert Bloch who had moved to Wisconsin to be with his wife's family. And at some point, when Gein was being interviewed by various psychiatrists, all these headlines in the papers were trumpeting the fact that Gein had been motivated by these deranged Oedipal conflicts, you know, that he was this desperately sick mama's boy. who was perpetrating these atrocities on middle-aged women, who reminded him of his mother. And this caught the attention of Robert Bloch, who decided this could potentially make the basis of a good horror novel, and that became the book Psycho. In the book Psycho, Norman Bates actually, after he's arrested, compares himself at the end of the book to Ed Gein. So the connection is made very, very explicit there in the book. Anyway, Psycho, as we know, turned into one of the great classic horror movies of American cinema. If you look at horror movies before then, there were all these Eastern European monsters, Frankenstein and Dracula and the Wolfman, or else they were aliens from outer space. With Psycho establishes, and, Ed Gein establishes, this quintessentially American figure of horror, the ordinary middle American guy who turns out to be this monster in disguise. And then, of course, Gein becomes the basis for Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and later on for Thomas Harris's character Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. So Gein has this very, very direct influence on American horror cinema.
But Gein's crimes were not fictional, they were very real, and he remains one of the most infamous murderers in US history.
We think of Gein as this notorious American serial murderer, but in many ways he doesn't really fit that profile. For example, he wasn't a sexual sadist in the way John Wayne Gacy or Ted Bundy were, or Jeffrey Dahmer. He wasn't driven by that particular form of deviance.
I think he was brought up in a vacuum that created the conditions for someone who would go on to do evil things. So whilst most people are shocked and repulsed and absolutely horrified at some of the things he's done, because he didn't have that filter and that check on his behaviour, he was able to escalate to a level of evil, I think.
Evil is something that, professionally, people don't believe in evil. But I truly believe that he was evil. I think there are people who would like to say that the devil got into him and made him do these awful things, but I think he was born evil.
The Ed I knew was not an evil person. He did things that normal people do not do. And there's just no doubt about that. And to kill two people is certainly not a person who you would really like to invite to your neighborhood party. But yeah, he was. There was something in his head that didn't click right.
Ed Gein's crimes are the stuff of genuine nightmares. The man with an unhealthy obsession with his mother brazenly murdered two women and kept a bizarre collection of gruesome keepsakes inside his house of horrors. He truly deserves to be remembered as one of the world's most evil killers.